Welcome to part 3 in this series on Prodigal Israel. So far we have seen that in 1867, which was a Jubilee year, the Lord began to move in a wonderful way through completely unsuspecting individuals that played a part in fulfilling the predictions that were made in Scripture by Moses and Zechariah. And in this episode I want to introduce you to a third player, third witness, that plays a very vital role in the development of the nation of Israel and the return to the homeland, because that's what the Jubilee is all about, is returning the land to the original owners. And so God started the ball rolling in 1867, and it continues to go through as we look at various historical events. We'll see how that the Lord is moving and working behind the scenes, but in a wonderful way, to bring his people back to their land and prepare us for the second coming of Jesus Christ. A lot of these historical facts that I'm talking about in this series have been well known and well documented. They're historical facts. But it's only in recent times, in the book called The Oracle by Jonathan Cahn, that he was able to put them together and tie them to the year of Jubilee, and we begin to see that actually, while these historical facts and these people seem to be insignificant, historically speaking, when we tie them together with God's timepiece and the Jubilee and the people of God, Israel, we begin to see that actually these events are extremely significant, and they're all pointers towards what God is doing, but also fulfilling these ancient predictions and prophecies by Moses and Zechariah, which is quite an amazing thing. Now you may wonder why these things have been hidden for so long and now they're coming to the fore. So let me just offer an answer to that question by looking at what Moses had to say. So we'll revisit the prophecies that Moses uttered way back in the book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy chapter 29 verse 22, Moses says, "And the next generation, your children who rise up after you, and the foreigner," Mark Twain, remember, "who comes from a far land will say, when they see the afflictions of that land and the sicknesses with which the Lord has made it sick." And then he goes on, I won't read the whole passage, to talk about the desolation and the destruction of the whole place. And then in the very next chapter, Moses goes on to say, "But if you return," so he says, this is chapter 30 now, "and when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today, with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you. And he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you. And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it. And he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live." So here is the wonderful prophecy. If Israel turn back to the Lord and follow him with all of their heart, then the Lord is going to return them to the land and prosper them. And then, quite amazingly, tucked between these two chapters is this very interesting verse. Moses says, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of the law." So the things that are revealed are the things that we need to obey and walk in. The Lord has revealed so much as it goes on into the New Testament, the revelation of the Lord Jesus, salvation through him. All these things are revealed, and these are the things that we must embrace and obey with all of our heart. But then Moses says there are secret things that belong to the Lord. So some of those secret things are being revealed now as we put these historical events together and recognize that actually God has been working quietly behind the scenes, under the radar, bringing his people together and shaping history and shaping nations so that Israel may be returned to their promised land and that God may fulfill the prophecy of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 30. So this is an amazing thing. So that's why I think that we've not been aware of these historical events, but it's only now, as we look back in hindsight, that the Lord is beginning to put the picture together to help us to realize that we're heading into the very last of the end times, and this is the preparation for the return of the King of Kings. I want to relate a personal experience that I had with Jewish people and my understanding and insight that I gained from this incident. I attended a predominantly Jewish high school in Johannesburg, and we had to move between classrooms depending on the subject that we were doing. And we just arrived at our maths class and were settling into our semi-conscious state in preparation for this long maths period, when a Jewish straggler, he had obviously been delayed somewhere along the way, wandered into the classroom, and upon arriving at his desk, he let out a blood-curdling yell, shattering our daydreams, waking us all up. He then stormed out of the class, demanding that his desk be removed and a replacement found. On investigation, it was discovered that the previous occupant of the offending desk had exercised his woodworking skills and carved a Nazi swastika into the surface of the desk, and this was obviously the great offence. While the teacher was trying to restore order and locate a replacement desk, he spotted me sharing my delight with my neighbour that the maths lesson had been shortened. I wasn't amused at what happened to the Jew. I was just amused that the maths lesson had now been interrupted and shortened. He completely misread my gesture and he bellowed, "Harris!" which caught my attention. Then he said, "Write out for me the book of Genesis." Now, he was actually wrong on two counts. One, I was not amused, as I said, by the insult to the offended Jew, because as a Christian, I had a high regard for the Jews even back then. And I understood the offence. And number two, I had very high regard for the book of Genesis. So this was not really a punishment to me. I also, of course, would have employed subcontractors to do the writing if this punishment had to be carried out. You don't spend time with the Jews without learning a trick or two. But the teacher then seemed to gather himself and recognize that he had made an error, and so he withdrew the punishment. Fortunately, or maybe even unfortunately, might have been good to write out the book of Genesis. But now, on reflection, thinking about this whole thing, I realized that these Jewish students who were born in South Africa and were as South African as the rest of us had a deep, almost subconscious feeling of being foreigners in their own country, and also had a persecution complex. Although never having been persecuted, it just seemed to be in their genes. Most of the Jews came from wealthy homes, and my observation of them was that they were diligent students. They were seldom seen in the predominantly Gentile naughty line outside the principal's office, and yet they seemed to have this insecurity that popped out at any sign of persecution or prejudice against them. All of that, I believe, is relevant as I share with you some of the insights that Mark Twain also spoke about and wrote about concerning his impression of the Jewish people, which I believe is all part of this great story and the understanding of the psyche of the Jewish people and of God's working with them to bring them back into their promised land. In 1868, that's the year after the 1867 Jubilee, our dear friend Mark Twain moved his whole family to Vienna in Austria, and he carried on his writing for various publications and newspapers, expressing his opinions and views and etc. And he also became a very popular public speaker because of his wit and because he was so candid. He never worried about being politically correct. He just spoke his mind, and people seemed to appreciate that. He received lots of letters and comments about the things that he had said, and he received a particular letter from a Jewish lawyer in America, and there were 6 points that this lawyer raised, and he was wanting Mark's impression of these and his insights into these particular issues. The first one was, he said, the Jew is a well-behaved citizen. So he wanted Mark's reaction to that. He then asked, can ignorance and fanaticism alone account for his unjust treatment? Jews were being unjustly treated in so many areas around the world, and that's what he wanted to know. Can the Jews do anything to improve the situation? The Jews have no party. They are non-participants in political things. That's what his impression was. Will the persecution ever come to an end? And then, what has become of the golden rule? Do to others what you'd have them do to yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. What has happened to that golden rule around the world? So he was wanting Mark's impression and his insights into these particular issues. Now, what is interesting to me is here was a successful and a wealthy Jewish lawyer in America, but these were the things that were still worrying him. And this confirms my impression of the Jews in the school where I was, that here was a Jewish lawyer having the same issues. Down deep inside, there were these insecurities and these questions worrying him. So I'm just going to touch on some of the things that Mark said in response to these points that were raised by this lawyer, because I really believe it's very helpful to us to understand the Jewish psyche. I do appreciate that while I go through these points, it may lull you into a very peaceful doze, but can I suggest that when you wake up that you grab a cup of coffee and concentrate on these points, because I do believe that they shape our understanding of the Lord's working behind the scenes. So this is how Mark Twain responded to the lawyer and his 6 points. So he started off by saying, I'll begin by saying that if I thought myself prejudiced against the Jew, I should hold it fairest to leave this subject to a person not crippled in that way. In other words, not crippled by prejudice. But I think I have no such prejudice. A few years ago, a Jew observed to me that there was no uncourteous reference to his people in my books and asked how it happened. It happened because the disposition was lacking. In other words, I don't have any prejudice. I'm quite sure that bar one, now the bar one, he's referring in another place to the French. He didn't like the French because they falsely accused a Jew, so he has got a prejudice against the French. I have no race prejudices, and I think I have no colour prejudices, nor caste prejudices, nor creed prejudices. Indeed, I know it. I can stand any society. All that I care to know is that a man is a human being. That is enough for me. He can't be any worse. Now, while Mark Twain was actually a skeptic and not a Christian, this really is a wonderful Christian view that all of us should hold. I'm not going to go through all 6 points, but if you can bear with me, I just want to go into a little bit of detail on the first 3, because I think they're very relevant and interesting. So Mark says, point number 1, we must grant proposition number 1. In other words, he's agreeing with what the lawyer is saying, for several sufficient reasons. The Jew is not a disturber of the peace of any country. Even his enemies will concede that. He's not a loafer, he's not a sot, not too sure what he means by that. He is not noisy, he's not a brawler, nor a rioter. He is not quarrelsome, although I would say that when Jews are arguing between themselves, they can be pretty quarrelsome and pretty loud, pretty noisy. In the statistics of crime, his presence is conspicuously rare in all countries. With murder and other crimes of violence, he has but little to do. He is a stranger to the hangman. In the police court's daily long roll of assaults and drunk disorders, his name seldom appears. That the Jewish home is a home in the truest sense is a fact which no one will dispute. That's quite a high recommendation. The family is knitted together by the strongest affections. Its members show each other every due respect, and reverence for the elders is an inviolate law of the house. The Jew is not a burden on the charities of the state nor of the city. These could cease from their functions without affecting him. So the dole and the social security, he said, even if that drops away, the Jew is not dependent upon that. When he is well enough, he works. When he is incapacitated, his own people take care of him, not in a poor and stingy way, but with a fine and large benevolence. Now, that's the impression that he has of the Jews. I wonder what impression he would have of Christians if he were to view them in the same light, if we would stand up to this kind of scrutiny and also have this kind of testimony to the outside world. That's the challenging part of what he's saying about the Jews. So point number 2, can fanaticism alone account for this, the bad treatment of Jews? Years ago I used to think that it was responsible for nearly all of it, but latterly I have come to think that this was an error. Indeed, it is now my conviction that it is responsible for hardly any of it. In other words, religious fanaticism. He doesn't think that's the problem. He says, the Jews being legislated out of Russia. The reason is not concealed. So Russia is very open about why they're doing this. The movement was instituted because the Christian peasant and villager stood no chance against his commercial abilities. Now, when he talks about the Christians, he's not talking about born-again people, but people who are non-Jews and claim to be Christians, like the United States claims to be a Christian country. So he's saying it, using it in a very broad sense. He was always ready to lend money. The Jew was always ready to lend money on a crop and sell vodka and other necessities of life on credit while the crop was growing. That's the cleverness of the Jew. When settlement day came, he owned the crop. The next year or year after, he owned the farm, just like Joseph. So he's referring to Joseph in the Bible, saying the Jew is using the same principle that Joseph used. In the dull and ignorant England of John's time, that's the King John of the Robin Hood era, everyone got into debt to the Jew. He, the Jew, gathered all lucrative enterprises into his hands. He was the king of commerce. He was ready to be helpful in all profitable ways, profitable to himself. He even financed crusades for the rescue of the sepulchre, in other words, crusades to the Holy Land back in the day of King John. To wipe out his account with the nation and to restore business to its natural and incompetent channels, he had to be banished from the realm. So in other words, he's saying the Jews, the only way to stop the Jews from being commercially successful, they had to be banished from the area. With most people of necessity, bread and meat take first rank, religion second. I'm convinced that the persecution of the Jew is not due to any large degree to religious prejudice. No, the Jew is a money getter, and in getting his money, he is a very serious obstruction to less capable neighbors who are on the same quest. I think that is the trouble. So that is Mark Twain's very candid impression of the Jew, and the reason why the non-Jew is jealous of the Jews, and so they persecute them and ill-treat them. Now, point number 3, I'm just going to summarize, I won't go into the details. Here Mark Twain suggests that the Jews should concentrate their efforts and get into government to influence the improvement of the Jews' status. In other words, they must combine their efforts and be a force to be reckoned with. He says, speaking about that, speaking of the concentration, Dr. Herzl. Now he's introducing us to this very important person, Dr. Herzl, which we'll speak more about because he plays a very vital role in this whole thing. He says he has a clear insight into the value of that. Have you heard of his plan? He wishes to gather the Jews of the world together in Palestine with a government of their own under the suzerainty of the Sultan, I suppose. In other words, he's talking about the Sultan who was in charge of the Ottoman Empire, who owned the land that the Jews were talking about, the Holy Land that they wanted to go back to. At the convention of Bern last year, there were delegates from everywhere, Jewish delegates, And the proposal was received with decided favor. All the Jews were in favor of going to the promised land. The Lord had put this in their heart, and this is just after that year of Jubilee. So these were the wheels now turning as God is preparing them to dream about going back to their promised land, which at that time was an impossibility because of the Ottoman Empire. This then is what Mark Twain quite humorously then comments about, and he says, I'm not the Sultan and I'm not objecting to what the Jews say. If the concentration of the cunningest brains in the world were going to be made in a free country, bar Scotland, and he had some comments about Scotland, I think it would be politic to stop it. In other words, he's saying, I think it should be stopped because if they all were to collect in their own country, all the Jews, all the brains together, with their ability, they would be an unstoppable force. And then he uses this analogy and he says, if the horses knew their strength, we should not be able to ride them anymore. Now, having introduced this Dr. Herzl, let's look at the very important part that he plays, and he really is our third witness. Now, just like my Jewish classmate reacted to the Nazi swastika on his desk, there was a tremendous reaction from this Dr. Herzl to an incident that took place in France. So let me just quickly and briefly take you through that to understand what motivated Dr. Herzl to apply all his energies to realize this dream that he had. There was a man by the name of Alfred Dreyfus. He was a captain in the French army, but he was also a Jew. There was an allegation against him that he was taking military secrets and passing them on to the Germans. The Germans were the arch enemy of the French at that particular time. The only evidence against him was a crumpled up piece of paper that was found in the rubbish bin, and it had writing on it with information about the military secrets, but they assumed that this writing belonged to Alfred Dreyfus. So they stripped him of his rank, they gave him a dishonorable discharge, they broke his sword ceremonially to punish him, and then they had a secret trial. The public had no access to any of the information. It was all done in secret. And he was banished to Devil's Island for 4 years of solitary confinement. There in the jail, he grew weak and quite sickly over that period of time. But even greater punishment to him was the fact that he'd been branded as a traitor, although he was actually a very good soldier and totally loyal to the French army. Then a man by the name of Émile Zola later went into and investigated all this information, and he wanted to reopen the case. So he wrote an article that was very damaging to both the government, the French government, and the army, and he called it L'Accuse, which means I accuse. And he accused the government and the army of a miscarriage of justice, and that he said that Alfred Dreyfus was only accused, and this thing was laid at his door simply because he was a Jew. So this outraged the Jews. It was horrific. On closer examination of the evidence, they found that actually the handwriting belonged to this man, also in the French army, but he was not a Jew. And because of the embarrassment of having accused Dreyfus for the crime, they now acquitted this man, and they just somehow did away with all the evidence. This man shaved off his moustache and he ran from the country. So this is where our third witness comes in, Theodore Herzl, because he was so enraged by this. Although eventually when the French government changed, they reinstated Alfred Dreyfus and they gave him a rank. In fact, they promoted him, and he also played his part in the First World War. But this so enraged Herzl that it inspired him to continue with his dream for a Zionist party and for a holy land, for the children of Israel to go back, for the Jews to reoccupy the Holy Land. And so he became the driving force behind this whole dream. So Theodore Herzl wrote in his diary in 1868 that he had this dream, although he realized it was virtually impossible, that all the Jews go back to the Holy Land and occupy it. It seemed an insurmountable thing, but somehow he was so driven to do it that he made contact with all the heads of state, the German heads of state, the French. He also went to Palestine, and there in the top left-hand corner is a picture of him on the boat heading to Palestine to go and meet with the leaders of the Ottoman Empire. The picture below is the Bern Congress of the Jewish people, the Zionist Congress, where they made the decision that they needed to go back to the Holy Land. So this man was behind this whole thing. He never realized it. He never saw the Holy Land because he died at the age of 44. He worked himself to death, they say. He had a heart attack and died, but he was the driving force. He is regarded as the father of political Zionism and as the father of the Jewish state in Israel. So to understand his position in the Jewish thinking, here is a picture in 1948 when the Jewish state was being announced. There is the picture of Theodore Herzl on the wall at the back. So very prominent in the Jewish thinking, and they held him in very high regard for all the work that he did to try and get the Jews back into their Holy Land. You might remember that Joseph, back in the Bible, he said that when the Jews leave Egypt, they must take his bones with them and bury them in the Promised Land. Now, Herzl had a very similar idea because he wrote in his will that when the Jews are back in their Promised Land, because he really believed that they would get back, that they must take his bones and bury them in the Promised Land. And that's exactly what they did. So here in this picture is where his bones had been brought back to Israel. Israel had been reinstated. This was in 1949, and they brought his bones to bury them in the Promised Land as he had requested. So finally, here is a picture of the memorial stone of Dr. Theodore Herzl on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. They named a mountain after him in his honor as the father of modern Jewish political Zionism. Now, if you've survived all the information that I've given you up to this point, I must congratulate you. Well done. But please allow me, in conclusion, just to make some challenging observations about all of this. It is clear that generally speaking, Jews are a great asset to have in any country. They contribute to the economy, they look after themselves, and they really are involved in crimes, etc. The question is, why would they want to leave their comfortable surroundings and countries and go and live in a semi-desert that is not an economically viable prospect and owned and governed by the Ottoman Empire? Firstly, we know that according to Moses' prophecy, this is God's ultimate plan for them. But what has God had to use to get them to move? The answer is persecution. Both Mark Twain and Charles Warren observed that in 1867 the Jews were in the minority in Palestine, but only a couple of years later the Jews were in the majority, even under the Ottoman rule. What drove them there? The answer is the Russian persecution and then later the horrific Holocaust under the Nazis. So it was persecution that forced them to move and go into the Promised Land. This was all part of God's plan, but it seemed that he had to use persecution to get them to move out of their comfort zone. Now, the thing is, what lessons can we learn from this? Would the man in the street or the candid Mark Twains of this world characterize Christians in general as great assets in any country, do you think? I think the general impression is that Christians have a self-righteous attitude. They're critical and judgmental. They're so divided because they cannot agree on a million different points. Some sectors even use the gospel to rob the poor and enrich themselves. So that's just the general impression of Christians, but of course there are pockets of very wonderful people amongst them. Many Christians make very little contribution to society around them simply because their focus is to get out of here and go to heaven. They've got no interest in this world. They believe they're just passing through, and the main goal is to get to heaven. So they don't make any contribution like the Jews do when they live in a certain country. So this is a far cry from what Jesus said would identify his followers. He said, "People will know us by our love and care for one another." The question then is, what will unify Christians and cause them to be known by their fruit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? It seems that if we can learn anything from God's dealing with the Jews, he may have to use persecution to purify his bride. It's also worth noting that at no time in church history has the church been without persecution in some part of the world. And where they are persecuted, they flourish and grow. While these are very sobering thoughts, let us be comforted by the fact that we can come boldly, even now, to the throne of grace and obtain mercy and find grace to help us to abide in Jesus the vine, so that his character can shine through us. So I find these things very challenging as a Christian. So whether we're Jews or Gentiles who follow the Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ, may we produce the fruit and not be known for our knowledge of good and evil, but may we be known for the character of Christ that shines through us. Let our light so shine that the nations around about us and the people of the world may see the brightness and glory and wonder of Jesus Christ, the King of the Jews, but also the King of the world. Amen.